It's a great honor and privilege for me to introduce you Professor Massey of Princeton University, our first keynote speaker. Professor Massey kindly accepted our invitation to this conference, and we deeply appreciate his presence and contribution to our conference. As far as I know, this is his first trip to Turkey, so also we are privileged by that. Of course, Professor Massey does not need any introduction, as he is very well known by us in the field of migration studies. But just I will give some highlights about him. He is the Henry Bryant Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs with the joint appointment in the Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton University. He's a member of National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Art and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society, and he is the current president of American Academy of Political and Social Sciences, and the former president of the American Sociological Association and Population Association of America. Also, he is the co-editor of the Annual Review of Sociology, the journal. He currently serves as the director of the Office of Population Research. His research focuses on, as we know, on international migration, race and housing, discrimination, education, urban poverty, stratification, and Latin America, especially Mexico. He has so many books and hundreds of articles, essays. His most recent ones, The Brokered Boundaries, Constructing Immigrant Identity in Anti-Immigrant Times, co-authored with the Scienceless, published by the Russell Sage Foundation. Another recent book of him actually was The Continental Divide, International Migration in Americas. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Massey to the podium and to give his keynote speech. The title of the speech is International Migration in Theory and Practice, a Case Study.
Thank you, Ahmet. It's a great honor to be here to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Migration Research Institute here at the University of Koch. Earlier today, my good friend and colleague Joaquin Arango referred to Massey et al. As the canon. Since I'm the Massey in Massey et al., I have a lot to answer for, since probably a majority of the students present here have been forced to read Massey et al. Let me tell you a little bit about how it all came about. It came about in, let's see, where are we? In the early 1990s. And I was minding my own business at the University of Chicago, and Massimo Livi Bacci, the president of the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population, approached me and said that migration is becoming an area of considerable study within demography, and everybody's running off in different directions and doing different things and not talking to one another. I want you to put together a committee that will review prevailing theories of migration, evaluate these theories relative to empirical evidence, and create an integrated conceptual framework based on this theoretical review and empirical evaluation. With Massimo, we picked a committee, including Joaquin Arango. It was a multinational, multidisciplinary committee embracing sociology, economics, geography, and demography, all the major world regions. The working language of the committee was English, but there were lots of side conversations in Spanish and French. You all, this is Massey et al. To your left, the article that appeared in 1993 in Population and Development Review, and the fuller treatment, the Massey et al. 2, in the book Worlds in Motion. With which we fulfilled our charge from the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population, IUSSP. The contents, we had a brief introduction, and then we basically reprised Massey et al. 1987 in our chapter on contemporary theories, and then went through and evaluated the theories empirically according to the evidence that was available in the early to mid-1990s at the different migration systems around the world, in North America and Europe, the Gulf, Asia and the Pacific, and South America, and then we had a couple of chapters on migration and development. I didn't know it was going to turn into the canon at the time, but I think we fulfilled our pledge to the IUSSP with our work. In the 1990s, the prevailing paradigms were basically in economics and sociology. Our charge was to focus on the causes of migration more than the consequences, to understand how migrant flows were generated and sustained rather than how immigrants were integrated into societies. So we looked at neoclassical economics, of course, the macro model of Reines and Fay, which is basically arguing that international migration involves a matching of labor supply and demand across borders. The micro version of the theory, best exemplified by Todaro's model, where people are making a cost-benefit analysis, looking at the costs of migration, looking at the benefits of migration, looking at the income they will earn if they stay here versus the income they will earn at all the other potential areas, and then going to where they will maximize their lifetime earnings. That is the older version of economic theory. The newer version that was just coming online in the 1980s was called the New Economics of Labor Migration, which argued that there may be an income maximization motivation for migration, but there was also other economic motivations that are possible, and postulated that these occurred at the household level, with the development of household-level strategies to manage risk, overcome market failures, and reduce relative deprivation. You would manage risk if you're in a volatile economic climate and there's a lot of unemployment. One way you can manage risk is to diversify your labor portfolio, sending one member of the household to work in the United States, another one to work in Mexico City, while the rest of the family managed the farm in a rural community. And then if the economy goes down in Mexico, there's always the income stream from the United States to tide you over. So you would manage your risk in the same way that stock buyers manage risk by diversifying their stock portfolios. And then the overcoming of market failures. In Mexico, where I have done most of my work, mortgage markets are very nascent and insufficient, and people can't borrow money to construct their house. Well, if you can't get access to funds to borrow to build a house, you can migrate to the United States in a series of trips, save up the money, come back, and slowly build your house up and overcome the market failure. Segmented labor market theory comes out of structural institutional economics, most closely associated with Michael Piore and his dual labor market theory. Alejandro Portes, my colleague at Princeton, got into the act by postulating the existence of ethnic enclaves as another segment, a potential segment in the labor market with very different patterns of earning attainment. Then at the macro level, there was world systems theory, which kind of grew out of dependency theory from the 1960s, but really then in the 80s and 90s left dependency theory behind and really talked about the social and economic structure of global market relations and what happens when markets globalize. And finally, the social capital theory, networks, organizations, the social capital they provide, and the cumulative causation, the cumulative effect that networks and social capital accumulation have in promoting and then increasing migration over time, no matter what the original causes. Almost immediately after publishing the book, I realized that there was a big hole, that we hadn't talked about states and talked about state policy. So as soon as the book was done, I wrote another paper, this time by myself, to analyze and consider the role of the state as a theoretical element in trying to understand what happens to migrant flows over time, how they develop, and even how they're caused. Basically, after my review of the extant literature at that point, I came to the conclusion that migration policies depended a lot on macroeconomic conditions. During recessionary periods, governments tend to move toward restriction. During boom periods, they tend to move towards openness. Inequality seems to be a bigger factor than actual wage rates in predicting the direction of immigration policy. So during times of rising inequality, there's move towards restriction. Of course, the scale and nature of the immigration plays a role. When there are large flows of culturally distant migrants, that tends to trigger resistance and restriction. Ideology plays a role. Neoliberalism and free trade promote openness and open immigration policies, whereas populism and nationalism promote restriction. And then whatever the particular package of immigration policies a country decides to impose, whether they work or not is another question. And that has a lot to do with state capacity, which I considered in terms of the strength of the bureaucracy, the relative demand for entry, the strength of the protections for human rights within the country, and the independence of the judiciary, and of course traditions of immigration matter. So immigration means something entirely different in places like Canada and the United States than most places in Europe, because our identity is that we are a country of immigrants. So that was my theoretical framework that I began to employ increasingly in my own work, studying migration from Latin America to the United States. And what I concluded after a long time, it finally dawned on me that policymakers didn't make immigration policy with any understanding of immigration, nor did they even care about immigration. Immigration policy was made for domestic political reasons. And typically, what you find out about immigration policy is that it reflects a country's hopes and aspirations and its fears and insecurities. And by looking at policy shifts, what you learn is not about what's happening with immigration, which is almost irrelevant. What you learn about is what people are aspiring to and what they're afraid of. And so what I will argue today is that the shape and the consequence, the pattern, the path of immigration in the United States and the outcomes that we observe are partially determined by those things that we discussed in the canonical work. That is, market fundamentals on both sides, supply and demand, networks, all those things played an important role. But the final form that the migration took had everything to do with policy, and it was policy that was enacted in ways that were totally disconnected from the underlying realities of immigration. So let me give you the historical background to what I'm talking about. So the first fateful decision that was made in the United States reflected its hopes and aspirations rather than its fears, fears and insecurities. And this occurred in 1965. In 1965, there was a major set of amendments to the U.S. Immigration and Nationality Act. And in 1965, the United States unilaterally terminated a long-standing guest worker program known as the Bracero program, which from 1942 to 1964 had brought between 5 and 6 million temporary workers into the United States from Mexico for short terms of labor of 6 months to a year. And at the height of the Bracero program in the late 1950s, there were 450,000 Bracero migrants coming into the United States on an annual basis. And in the late 1950s, the flow of legal immigrants to the United States was on the order of 50,000 visa people per year, entries per year. So we had about 500,000 Mexicans coming into the United States every year, overwhelmingly circulating back and forth. Even among those with permanent residence visas, huge chunks of them would return to Mexico on an annual basis. And that was the status quo. Then in the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement happened. And this changed perceptions. And in 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act came to be seen as intolerably racist and prejudicial, which, of course, it was. It banned immigration from Africa, it banned immigration from Asia, and it set up restrictive quotas for European immigration to encourage migrants from Northern and Western Europe and to keep out migrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. And by 1965, in the throes of the Civil Rights Movement, immigration reform was put forth not as an immigration policy, but as a civil rights policy to eliminate racism from the American immigration system. And the Bracero program had come to be seen as an exploitive labor program on a par with sharecropping of African Americans in the South. And so Congress acted. It ended unilaterally, just blanket stopped at the end of 1964, the Bracero program, and it passed amendments to the Immigration and Nationality Act that got rid of the restrictive quotas and rid of the bans and put in a new system that allocated visas according to family reunification criteria and labor needs in the United States. And they capped visas at about 300,000 visas per year, and they allocated the visas through a preference program that was neutral with respect to race and ethnicity and nationality, and they capped visas for each country at about 20,000 visas per year, per country. Now, this is important because you often hear, oh, the 1965 acts caused a boom in Latin American migration, but nothing could be further from the truth. Until 1965, there were no limits, no numerical limits at all on migration from anywhere in the Western Hemisphere into the United States. There were no numerical limits on Latin American immigration to the U.S. before 1965. In 1965, they put them under a quota, a hemispheric quota of 120,000 visas per year for the entire Western Hemisphere. And then over the next several years, they phased in a system whereby in 1976, the Western and Eastern Hemispheres, the entire world was put under a single worldwide quota of 290,000 visas, and each country, including all those in the Western Hemisphere, had a cap of 20,000 visas per year. So they had implemented this system with very noble intentions, but they gave no thought whatsoever to what was going to happen to the flow of 500,000 people into the United States that had built up over 22 years of the Bracero program, and by the late 1950s was bringing in 500,000 people every single year through circular labor migration. Well, of course, the end of opportunities for legal migration, cutting down from 500,000 legal entries per year to 20,000 per year, didn't stop the migration because the conditions of supply and demand on both sides hadn't changed. Over 22 years of Bracero migration, networks had formed and become well established and linked countless numbers of villages and communities in Mexico with employers and destinations in the U.S. So what happened, you see here, I've plotted out between 1965 and 1995, migration in three categories. Legal immigrants, that's the solid line, temporary migrants, which is the dotted line, and then undocumented migrants, illegal migrants, and that's the dashed line. So this is using official American immigration statistics, and I proxy illegal migration by looking at the number of illegal apprehensions divided by the number of Border Patrol officers. So apprehensions by themselves are flawed because they go up when the enforcement effort goes up. But you standardize for the enforcement effort. It doesn't really give you the number of undocumented entries. It's a pretty good proxy, but it gives you the trend. And what you see is that as the Bracero program ended, over a period of about 10 years, undocumented migration simply rose to replace it. And then the restoration of migration under undocumented auspices basically stopped increasing around 1978, 79, and then it fluctuated. So the undocumented migration simply replaced flows that had already been there. Nothing had changed except really the legal status of the people coming and going. And from 1965 to 1985, the vast majority of these entries were offset by departures. So in estimates that I've generated with colleague Audrey Singer, we found that from 1965 to 1985, for every 100 entries, there are 85 returns in the average year, in any given year. So the size of the undocumented population actually grew very slowly. So the first fateful decision was, for noble reasons, to eliminate racism from U.S. immigration, which, without really thinking about it, cut off a legal flow that had become well established and led to the rise of a flow of about the same size of undocumented migrants. Second fateful decision that greatly impacted immigration in the U.S. was America's Cold War intervention in Central America, part of the Cold War ideology. The U.S. military intervention in Central America occurred during the 1980s in response to the coming to power in 1979 of the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua. The Sandinista regime allied itself with the Soviet Union, was a leftist regime, and prompted a massive American military and political intervention in the region, which produced a decade of civil war, shrinking economies, and massive displacement of people. So as a result of our intervention, there was a surge of refugees from El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Honduras, the frontline states in the proxy war with the Soviet Union. And Nicaraguans, of course, were granted temporary protected status and then quickly allowed to adjust status to become legal permanent residents under something called NACARA, the Nicaraguan Adjustment and Central American Refugee Act. But Salvadorans, Hondurans, and Guatemalans were not eligible for adjustment to permanent legal resident status because they were fleeing right-wing governments allied with the United States. Nicaraguans were fleeing a left-wing government, so they got a red carpet to permanent resident status. Very few were given temporary protected status among Salvadorans, Guatemalans, and Hondurans, and even fewer were allowed to adjust to legal permanent residence. And this is an indicator of the intensity of the U.S. intervention that I constructed by looking at the frequency of historical references in U.S. newspapers. I did a search on war, killing, and death, plus the name of each country, and came up with this pattern showing the intensity of the U.S. intervention in the late 70s, 80s, peaking, and then dropping with the Central American Peace Accords in the 1990s. And this is the probability of data that I collected from in the field, looking at the probability of taking a first undocumented trip to the United States from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. You can see it peaks in the same year that it peaked in the other series, and in regression models, the indicator completely explains the onset of migration to the United States and undocumented status. It has nothing to do with economic conditions on either side of the border. It's completely and totally a product of the U.S. intervention. As a result, we end up with an undocumented population in the U.S. by 2008 that is 62% Mexican and 14% Central American. So basically 3/4 of all immigrants, undocumented migrants, come from two places, Central America and Mexico, both a complete and total function of American policies and policy decisions. However, the rise of undocumented migration created a new political dynamic in the United States. It enabled political entrepreneurs, bureaucratic entrepreneurs to gain resources, to gain political power by framing Latino immigration and Latino immigrants as something very threatening to the United States. Immigration became a crisis. And the favored metaphors that were used with increasing frequency were floods and invasions. The United States was being flooded by a tidal wave of Latino immigrants who were going to drown American culture and inundate American society. As the Cold War grew on, and over time, flood metaphors gave way to invasion metaphors. The United States was being invaded by an army of illegal aliens who were overrunning Border Patrol officers who were desperately trying to hold the line and defend the country to prevent the invasion and occupation of the United States by Latinos. So immigrants increasingly were framed as a threat to American society and well-being. They were a threat because they were illegal. By definition, if they were illegal, they were criminals and lawbreakers. They were subversives, they were terrorists, they were invaders, occupiers, and that drumbeat increased over time. So this is taken from a work of an anthropologist named Leo Chavez at the University of California, Irvine. They documented the rise of the Latino threat narrative in the U.S. media by coding magazine covers for the three principal weekly news magazines in the United States, and looked at the frequency with which magazine covers that dealt with immigrants were coded as threatening or neutral or welcoming. And as you can see, over time, threatening metaphors increasingly come to dominate. The only time welcoming metaphors appeared were issues around the 4th of July, when the United States was ritually celebrated as a land of immigrants. It's frozen. So, as I said, the text used on covers revealed two framing metaphors, marine and metaphor, and martial, and over time the martial metaphors gained increasing prominence. This is some work that I did looking at the mentioning of Mexican immigration as a crisis, flood, or invasion in the leading American newspapers, and just a frequency count over time, smoothed with a 3-year moving average. And what you see is that in 1965, these metaphors were never used. Virtually no mention of immigration as a crisis, flood, or invasion. Then, as undocumented migration comes into existence and rises from 1965 to 1979, these metaphors increasingly increase. It peaks at the same time the rise in illegal migration peaks, and then, like the series that I showed you earlier, fluctuates thereafter. But every time it rises to a new peak, and the peaks correspond increasingly to economic conditions in the U.S. and political conditions in the U.S., each time there's a peak, another piece of anti-immigrant policy or legislation passes or is implemented. And this sets up this feedback loop, which I have actually parameterized, and this is published in an article in Population and Development Review. Basically, what you see is that illegal entries is the exogenous factor. They do start rising after 1965. You've cut off the flow of opportunities for legal entry. Illegal migration takes its place. So illegal entries rise. And of course, the rise of illegal entries produces a rise in apprehensions. But the rise in apprehensions becomes a rallying cry. The head of the Border Patrol uses the rising number of apprehensions as evidence of a rising invasion from below. And in 1976, published an article in Reader's Digest saying that 20 million illegal migrants were in the United States, and we were outgunned and armied at the border, and we needed more. And politicians began to take up this rhetoric, talk about the invasion from below, and it became the crisis. And that pushed American public opinion in an increasingly conservative direction, and that promoted restrictive legislation, restrictive border operations, increased the number of Border Patrol agents, the size of the Border Patrol budget, which produced more hours patrolling the border. And then that created the feedback. So you see, this started it all. Illegal entries produces apprehensions, but then starts a feedback loop where ultimately it generates a conservative reaction, which drives up line watch hours, which produces more apprehensions. This exogenous effect stops in 1979, stops rising. But apprehensions keep going up and up and up, not because more people are coming, but because more and more money is being poured into border enforcement, and the apprehensions keep rising. And then apprehensions become self-evident proof of the ongoing invasion. This illustrates what happened. The bottom line shows our estimate of the trend in the volume of illegal migration. The top line shows the number of apprehensions, which rise to a peak in 1986, when the U.S. passes a piece of legislation called the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which offers a legalization program that legalizes about 3 million former undocumented migrants and begins what proved to be a 2-decade-long militarization of the Mexico-U.S. border. The same thing, this looks at Central America's role in undocumented migration. You see that these are the predicted probabilities of taking a first trip from violence alone. If you just look at violence, migration would have gone back to the status quo ante. So you look at the line before 1980, and it's flat, and then you look at the line, the blue line after, blue line after 1990, and it's flat. But you can't go back to the status quo ante because of social capital effects, because of networks. So after you've replanted several million people from Central America in the United States, they've all got family and friends and networks connecting them back to Central America. So migration is going to continue and grow because of the social capital effects, which is what we're seeing today. So illegal migration became a prime opportunity for political opportunists of a variety of sorts. And as I said, it tells you more about what Americans are afraid of. And since 1965, U.S. immigration and border policy has always been framed about what we are afraid of in the United States. Not realities of immigration, not the size of the immigrant flow, it's about domestic politics, domestic fears. So in 1985, Ronald Reagan, in a speech, said terrorists and subversives are just 2 days driving time from the border crossing at Harlingen, Texas. And that communist agents will feed on the anger and frustration of recent Central and Central American immigrants who will not realize their own version of the American dream. Samuel P. Huntington, a distinguished professor of politics at Harvard, said, unlike past immigrant groups, Mexicans and other Latinos have not assimilated into the mainstream U.S. culture, forming instead their own political and linguistic enclaves. The United States ignores this challenge at its peril. Lou Dobbs, popular TV personality, invasion of illegal aliens was part of a war on the middle class. Anxieties about inequality rising, it's the immigrants' fault. Patrick Buchanan went so far as to allege that Mexicans had hatched an Aztlan plot to recapture the lands they lost to the United States in the Mexican-American War of 1848. If we do not get control of our borders and stop this greatest invasion in history, I see the dissolution of the U.S. and the loss of the American Southwest, culturally and linguistically, if not politically, to Mexico. I don't make this stuff up. Now, what are we afraid of now? ISIS. This is Texas Governor Rick Perry. It's a very real possibility that individuals in the extremist group ISIS may have crossed into the United States at the southern border. Individuals from ISIS or other terrorist states could be taking advantage of this situation. I think it's a very real possibility they may have already used the border for entry. Representative Jeff Duncan of South Carolina, wake up, America. With a porous border, we have no idea who's in our country. That's old news now. What's the new news? Ebola. Senate candidate in New Hampshire, Scott Brown, said, and this is a headline and a quote, people coming in through, said that he doesn't want undocumented migrants crossing into the U.S. Mexico because they might be carrying Ebola. People coming in through normal channels, can you imagine what they could do through the porous borders? And then he was backed up by a U.S. Marine Corps general who commanded the Southern Military Command, who said that he was in Costa Rica last week and he talked to an embassy employee who'd run across Liberians preparing to be smuggled into the U.S. What Liberians might be doing in Costa Rica was never clarified, and how they got there in the first place. If Ebola breaks out in Haiti or Central America, I think it's just Katie bar at the door in terms of mass migration in the United States. Whatever we're afraid of, it becomes projected on the border, and the border becomes a stage for political theater. The anthropologist Renato Rosaldo, from his theoretical point of view, said the U.S.-Mexico border has become theater, and border theater has become social violence. Actual violence has become inseparable from symbolic ritual on the border, crossings, invasions, lines of defense, high-tech surveillance, and more. And in practice, Representative O'Rourke, a Democrat of Texas, said, there's a long-standing history in this country of projecting whatever fears we have onto the border. In the absence of understanding the border, they insert their fears. Before it was Iran and Al-Qaeda, now it's ISIS. They just reached the conclusion that the invasion is imminent, and it never is. So the terrorist attacks played a huge role and created another feedback loop between deportations and the conservative reaction. As more and more people get deported and more deportations are announced every year, Americans are increasingly convinced that we're still being invaded, even though, and I'm telling you this now, illegal migration from Mexico stopped in 2008. There's been no net gain of illegal migrants from Mexico since 2008, but the deportations keep coming on in the news cycle, so we must be being invaded. And you can't read all this, but this is just the immigrant restriction legislation passed since 1965 to 2010. These are named border operations that have been launched in the name of enforcement. And you have to admire the Border Patrol's clever use of language. You got Operation Rapid Repat, Operation Return to Sender, all those clever military operations. And this is what the border looks like now. This is the Mexico-U.S. border. You're standing on a hill in Tijuana, Mexico. The Pacific Ocean is to your back, and you're looking to the east. To the left is the United States. To the right is Tijuana. Just for sake of comparison, a random example, this is the DMZ in Korea. The end result was a massive militarization of the Mexico-U.S. border. This is the budget of the Border Patrol in constant 2013 dollars over time. As you can see, there was the exponential increase starts in 1985, and then after 9/11, it just goes up beyond exponentially. It almost linearly straight up. Now, all of this had profound consequences on patterns and processes, the size, the distribution of the undocumented population in the United States and the Latino population in the United States. I'm going to tell you what had happened, and I'll show you the data and then finish up. The effects of the militarization on border outcomes was that it transferred the geography of border crossing, shifting them away from traditional crossing points to new crossing areas, increased the use of coyotes or border smugglers so that people were better able to get in, increased the cost of using coyotes, but had no effect on the probability of border apprehension, and increased the risk of death during border crossing. Those are the consequences on border outcomes. The effects of militarization on migrants' behavior, it had no effect on the likelihood of taking a first undocumented trip. It decreased, however, the likelihood of return from that trip. It also decreased the likelihood of taking an additional trip and decreased the likelihood of returning from an additional trip, basically cutting off the circular flow that had characterized Mexico-U.S. migration for decades. To show this, I'm using data from the Mexican Migration Project, which I co-direct with my colleague in Mexico, Jorge Durand. We've been collecting data continuously in Mexican surveys and communities throughout Mexico since 1987, and the current analysis is based on a large sample of documented and undocumented migrants today. And then we follow up with surveys on the U.S. side of people from those same communities who settled north of the border. So it's a binational data set. And I'm basically estimating models that are going to look at the effect of the rise in the Border Patrol's budget and control for all kinds of individual level characteristics, but also control for other factors in the U.S. context and the Mexican context that come out of economic theory. Basically, the rate of employment growth, measuring demand in the U.S., access to legal visas I control, and wage rates in the United States. In the Mexican side, we look at the crude birth rate, the rate of GDP growth in Mexico, and the homicide rate as a push factor, and Mexico's minimum daily wage. So we're going to look at the effect of Border Patrol enforcement, controlling for all those macro factors and all the individual factors. And rather than using the raw Border Patrol budget, which could be endogenous, the budget could increase because there are more people coming, we instrumented it. And it turns out that an excellent instrumental variable is the the budget of the Drug Enforcement Agency, which also grew over the time, but that was responding to not to immigrants coming in, but to the crack epidemic and drug use and everything like that. And so we use that as an instrument to generate an instrumental variable so we can estimate the causal influence of these variables. So what you see here, the solid lines are going to be the observed probability of crossing at a traditional location. The dashed line is what's predicted from the Border Patrol budget, holding constant all those other things. So you can see that there was an observed drop in the probability of crossing at a traditional place. That's Tijuana, San Diego, El Paso, Juarez, two places that accounted for 85% of the flow before. And because of the border militarization, the flows were pushed away from California in particular, through the Sonoran Desert into Arizona, a state that hadn't received significant Mexican immigration since 1920s. We increased the probability of using a coyote, a professional smuggler. And again, the dashed line indicates the causal effect, and then the solid is the observed. Increased the costs of border crossing, going from about $500 a crossing to about $2,500 a crossing over the period. But it had no effect on the probability of apprehension. The solid line shows the observed probability, and the dashed line shows the predicted probability, the causal effect. And it's up slightly, but that's not even a significant effect in statistical terms. And the dotted line at the top shows the probability of getting into the United States over a series of repeated trials, if you were unfortunate enough to get apprehended. So you can see that the probability of getting into the United States from 1970 through 2008 or so is 95 to 100%. So you're spending $3 to $4 billion a year in border enforcement, and you have no effect on the probability of apprehension or getting in. You did increase the rate of deaths dramatically. And this really tells a lot about the story. What you see here, the dashed line shows the probability, the solid line shows the probability of taking a first undocumented trip to the United States, which bounces all over in response to economic conditions, but then it drops off to 0 by 2010, which is what I told you, there's no more illegal migration from Mexico. The dotted line shows you, the dashed line shows you what you would expect from the Border Patrol budget. So the decline is not occurring because of the Border Patrol budget. The causal effect is 0. What's causing the decline is the rise in the average age of people at risk of migration, and that's because of the demographic transition in Mexico. Mexican population growth has plummeted. And so basically we're spending $3, $4 billion a year in enforcement to no effect in an attempt to end something that was on its way to ending under natural circumstances anyway. This shows a completer picture. So this shows, the dashed line shows what would happen if it were only U.S. economic fundamentals working, and the dotted line shows only Mexican economic fundamentals working. And if they were the only thing working, we would still have migration from Mexico. But because of the demographic transition, that's what's pushing the line down. You can see the demographic transition, the drop in the population growth rate in Mexico. These are age pyramids, 1990, 2000, 2010, 2020 projected. So you can see that it's already constricting. The labor force growth is not increasing, it's decelerating. Mexico is becoming an aging society. Mexico has roughly the same fertility rate as the United States. The effect that it did have was the militarizing the border dramatically reduced the probability of return migration among those who had entered. So this shows the observed and the predicted rate of return, predicted probability of returning from a first trip within 12 months, predicted from the causal effect of the Border Patrol's budget and the observed, which bounces around because of the economic effects, but the downward trend is entirely explained by our militarization of the border. So, to summarize, the consequence of the war on immigrants that was unleashed, from 1986 to 2010, the U.S. spent around $35 billion in border enforcement, and in so doing, transformed what had been a circular flow of male workers going to 3 states into a settled population of families living in 50 states, reduced outmigration while leaving in-migration unchanged to double the net rate of undocumented migration and population growth, created a population of 11 million undocumented U.S. residents, 60% of whom are Mexican, and 2/3 of all 60% of Mexican immigrants are undocumented, and 2/3 of all Central American immigrants are undocumented, all while attempting to end an undocumented flow that would have ended of its own accord after 2000 because of the demographic transition in Mexico. Now we have a phenomenon of mass illegality among Latino immigrants in the United States. These are the estimated percentages illegal in the different national origin populations of immigrants. So, what do I learn? Immigration policy is often made without any regard to the realities of immigration. The first effect was the civil rights movement. Then there was the Latino threat narrative, which fed into the Cold War rhetoric, then the war on terror, and most recently the threat of Ebola. Immigration policy has powerful effects on patterns and processes of immigration. They strongly affect patterns of departure and return, the geography of entry and settlement. And these effects are often unexpected and unintended. We pushed through our policies a circular process to become a settled process. And we brought about, despite the racist motivations of a lot of the opponents of immigration reform, they actually increased the Latinoization of American society. Future of migration theory. Somehow we need to figure out how to incorporate state behavior better into theories of migration. The fundamentals of migration would not predict the outcomes that we observe in the North American migration system. They were a consequence of political decisions that were taken because migrants became a ploy in domestic political discussions, in domestic political debates. Migrants were not important as immigrants. Migrants were important as framing devices. The border became a framing device. I testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee some years ago, and Senator Charles Schumer, a liberal Democrat from New York, says the Mexico-U.S. border is the front line in the war on terror. And that's accepted as reality in Washington, D.C. And of course, it's nonsense, and there's no Ebola in Mexico, and there are no terrorist cells in Mexico. But nonetheless, that becomes the framing device, that becomes the political reality, and the immigrants and the border are simply pawns dealing with American internal fears and internal perceptions of threat. Important role was played by the demographic transition in this case. If you look at the effect of birth rates and growth rates on the probability of migration, it doesn't have any effect. But if you look at the effect of demographic conditions on the number of migrants, it has a big effect. So whatever the policies that are producing migration, if you got a big cohort of people coming of migratory age, you get a lot of migrants. But the direct effect is not really to influence migration itself. That really is a function of the aging that comes about as a result of the demographic transition, with the rising average age of people exposed to the risk of migration. Limitations of current social and economic theories. Well, I think state the lack of a good theory of state behavior and political behavior and how those things work and why they work and under what conditions they work and why they're undertaken. We need more work there and systemizing it. It's not simply the laundry list of factors that I published in my article in 1999. And I think we need to pay more attention to the rising importance of threat evasion as a motivation for migration. Most of the motivations we posit now are economic or social in nature, but the appearance of threat, and threats from climate change, threats from violence, threats from civil wars, these are becoming increasingly common and increasingly important. And I think they produce very different mechanisms of selection than the kind of logical, rationalized things we're assuming in theories so far. And I've been starting to do work looking at the effect of violence on migration. And what I'm finding in the studies that I've done so far is it's really hard to come to generalizations about how violence works. And there's something about the context that explains when and how violence generates streams of international migrants. So that's kind of where I'm working now. I'm sorry I took so long, but I look forward to any questions you might have. If you want a case study demonstration about how not to make immigration policy, the U.S. is your case. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Jan Raad from the University of Amsterdam. Thank you so much for this wonderful case study. I mean, I find it very, very impressive. But I see this rather as a start of a new research program rather than as the end of it. When you argue, that's true. Yeah, we noticed that. But you argue that there is a need to incorporate state behavior into the theory of immigration. But that raises the question: why is the state behaving in this way? And it seems to me that we are dealing with political entrepreneurs who are dealing with of responding to lack of trust in state institutions. And secondly, we're dealing with a very volatile media landscape. So what would be your reflection on that? I know there is always a risk that there's more and more and more to be studied, but it seems to me that this is unavoidable if you really want to understand how immigration policy works.
Yeah, and in retrospect, you'll notice that in that IUSSP committee, there was no political scientist, which I think was a mistake. And I think that we really do have to understand political choices and political behaviors within different nation states and try to generalize across different case studies that we study. And so I think precisely what you said, that's where we have to really pay some attention. I haven't done that work yet. I'm putting my mind to it, but first I want to write up the fiasco in book form, and then I'll turn my attention to some of the more broader theoretical questions in the coming years. But that's the direction. One of the directions I want to move is to think about why politicians do what they do with respect to immigration and the conditions under which they do it. Back there? Oh, back there? That's fine. Either one.
This is Tolga Aksoy. I am with the Journalists and Writers Foundation. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. As you know, just recently, actually last Tuesday, President Obama announced a new immigration law, and it will cover 4 million undocumented migrants, and it will provide work permits if they reside in the States for the last 5 years with no criminal records. My question is this, though. This will not cover the dreamers' parents or the farmers, as well as it will not provide affordable health care. There will be no subsidies for that. So my question is what do you think about that? The second is, do you think that this kind of laws will create a south to north immigration, another flow of migration? Thank you.
One point of clarification: Obama, at least the last time I checked the news, had made no announcement. These are all news leaks coming from reporters saying that Obama's thinking about doing these things. Nothing has been announced, so we don't know what Obama's planning to do. He said he's planning to take some kind of executive action, but we don't know what they are in concrete yet. I think there are a range of things he could do. The minimum, I think, would be to give legal status to the dreamers, which is about 1.5 million people. They're already in some kind of temporary legal status, and they're able to work. So it'd just be a matter of formalizing that over the longer term. At the other extreme, he could pardon 11 million people for their breaking of the law and parole them into the United States in the national interest. I think probably it's going to be somewhere in between. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know the parameters of what kind of legalization he's going to propose. So I'm waiting to see. And I don't know exactly what's going to happen. You never know with immigration until the policy is actually announced. And then, of course, it will spur a huge political fight. The Republicans will rise up in arms. They're going to sue the Obama administration in court. They're going to impeach him, probably. They're going to shut down the government. The Republican Party is dominated now by an electorate that's made up of older white males who are extremely discomfited and disturbed by the demographic change in the United States. Unfortunately for them, it's too late. That train left. In 2011, if you look at births in the United States, 25% of births were to Latina women, mothers, and less than 50% of births were to white Northern European mothers. So it's already built into the demographic structure of the United States. There's no way of going back. Even if there were no immigration ever again, and there were no amnesty, the Latino population of the United States is going to continue to grow from now on. And the only reality we can face is that we have to adapt to it and make that transition to a multi-ethnic, multiracial society, a minority-majority society, which is inevitable, as painless and as beneficial as possible. And that would involve legalization. But it's going to be a real political battle, and we'll see how it turns out. I don't think the Congress is going to change very much until after 2020, when there's redistricting once more. And we'll see what happens in the last 2 years of the Obama administration, and then in whatever administration follows it. But that is the cusp of American politics these days. Somebody else had a question back here?
Thank you very much. This is Deniz Yükseker of Koç University. We should be able to draw our own conclusions and some parallels between what you told about the US and Mexican migration in relation to the European Union's migration policies. So it was very, very eye-opening. I have a question of clarification. You showed a graph at some point, and you said that each time there was an increase in the migration scare discourse in the media, following that there would be some anti-immigration act.
Yeah.
But either I couldn't follow it, or I mean, at least I'm asking you for a clarification. In the case of the Patriot Act, I didn't see that. In fact, there was a downward trend in the
No, the Patriot Act was entirely a response to 9/11.
Yeah.
But the Patriot Act set the stage for further militarizations that are correlated with these swings. So, and you see them mostly in the acceleration of deportations, and you see them particularly in the launching of ever more frequent border operations. So you'll notice that in one of the things that's mentioned in the news stories about what Obama might do, whatever he might do, it always involves more border enforcement. Now, he knows that illegal migration from Mexico has been zero or negative for the past 4 or 5 years. And more money spent on border patrol is a complete and total waste of money. But it's such built into the political dynamics of the American debate that you can't do any immigration reform, can't do any liberalizing, unless you also show how tough you are at a border that no longer, and never did, but really doesn't need defending at all now. And you read about the Central American migrants. And the reason you're reading about Central American migrants is because now they're the only ones that they're crossing. So 15 years ago, we had 1.5 million apprehensions along the Mexico-US border, overwhelmingly Mexican. And now there are no Mexicans, and so 50,000 Central Americans make a lot of news. But it's only because basically net migration's around zero. And what you're seeing at Central American, at the border, are the kids of all those people that migrated as refugees during the US intervention, trying desperately to reunite with their families in America.
Would I be allowed to ask a follow-up question?
One. The boss says one.
Okay, maybe I'll give up. I'll let someone
Okay. He said you can do one more. Okay, well, thank you for your attention.